The story begins at night with a view of a huge palace. The main character, named Adeline, looking at some man, just wanted to be treated like other people. A man in a black cloak, looking at the protagonist with a mysterious look, held a sword in his hands, preparing for something. Meanwhile, the protagonist had a small blade behind her back the whole time and was preparing to deal with this man. As she thought about it, she realized that someday that moment would come, and she would die in this place. She suddenly drew her blade and attacked the guy. However, the man sharply stuck his sword into the girl's body, crying and gently touching the boy's face. Adeline didn't want to admit the 25 years that had passed without meaning. Lying on the floor, she still couldn't believe he'd dealt with her, and all she wanted was just another chance. Suddenly, she opened her eyes. "You're in a completely different place, in a state of complete incomprehension of what's going on." A maid named Elda asked the girl how she was feeling, which surprised the girl a little. She didn't realize how Elda was alive, so she's not sure if she passed away. She remembered how it was the maid who had informed the Count that Adeline was not really his child. But on that packet where the identity of the protagonist Elda had been revealed, they were merely uninvited guests. Her parents and even her relatives called her an unwanted child and treated her like garbage just because she was an illegitimate child. At that moment, Adeline hugged the maid sharply, couldn't hold back her tears as she realized that she was the only person who had stood by her side in such a hellish place. Sitting on the bed talking to the maid, Elda asked if the girl really wanted to marry the Duke. But Adeline calmly asked the maid not to worry, as she would be fine, which made Elda a little sad, as she was really worried and very nervous. And as you've probably already realized, today is a wedding date, an engagement ceremony with no love feelings, and a marriage that consists only of a piece of paper. On reflection, the protagonist thought she would do her best to leave the Lawton household. But even after the wedding, she was still treated like a useless child. Though she doesn't understand how she got back to that day, she now has a second chance that she must use to live life her way. Suddenly, some girl approached Adeline and smirking said that clothes make the man, and the clothes that the protagonist is wearing now are not so good, as would probably have already realized. This girl is the sister of the protagonist, and her name is Bianca Lawton. Approaching the protagonist, Bianca didn't understand who in my right mind would want to marry the protagonist. And that Duke who wants to marry her has very interesting tastes. At that moment, Adeline remembered how in her past life she had replied to her sister that she too did not understand why anyone would choose to marry an illegitimate child like her. Now, however, the protagonist smirkingly replied that she should be thankful for the fact that some man had chosen her as well. Meanwhile, Elda watched the two sisters talking to each other, a little surprised that Adeline didn't use honorifics. Adeline reasoned, and realized that the maid wasn't crying like she did last time, which meant she could change her future with her powers. The protagonist also added that unlike her sister, she has a man who is going to marry her. When Bianca heard that, she was furious, and tried to justify herself by saying that the main character is on a simple, humble duke, and why would she be jealous of her at all? Then Adeline decided to apologize and smirked and said that they had different situations since no one had even picked Bianca. When Bianca heard that, she got angry and wanted to attack her sister because she couldn't tolerate being treated like that by an illegitimate child. Suddenly, the butler interrupted their conversation by saying that Duke Benzark wished the presence of the protagonist in the drawing room. Then the protagonist exhaled, said goodbye to her sister, and went into the living room. Walking around the palace, she realized that she had no way of knowing if this opportunity was given to her by God or if it was some unknown force. However, she realized that in either case there must be some reason why she had returned on the day of her marriage. A place that no one can leave alive is called the Land of Darkness. A brutal duke ruled over that territory. Also, he possessed such a powerful force that even the emperor himself could not bother him. This man was Harase Benzark. Entering the living room, the protagonist finally saw her dishonorable husband, the one she loved the most. However, she still died by his own sword, looking straight into the guy's eyes and bowing down to him. She couldn't believe she was seeing him again. She held out her hand to him and smiled. She asked him if he would accompany her. Meanwhile, looking at the girl, he remembered the prophecy he'd dreamed. In this dream, he dreamt of some girl holding a book ordering Harase to find Adeline Lawton and use her to make the world yours. A couple days ago in Harase's living room, some man was talking about the captain's dream. The man turned out to be Aster Leffa, and he added that it could be the prophet they've been looking for. He also speculated that this prophet most likely has something to do with the honored daughter of the count's household. So they need to wait, and the killer is whether they are prophets or not. However, he did note that they should bring her in before they take notice. In addition, Aster told the Duke that the protagonist was very frightened when she heard the Duke's name, and that the marriage proposal was accepted very quickly, which makes the guy a little wary. Of course, there will be no wedding, but the Duke should at least go himself and get the bride I've signed up to, at least show her a little bit of his sincerity, since Adeline is pitiful. Also, Aster added that the protagonist is not a very submissive and modest lady, so it wouldn't be a huge deal for the Duke to go for the engagement. Back to the moment where the Duke looks the protagonist straight in the eye. The Duke began to doubt his friend's words when he called her a pathetic and modest lady, for the Duke did not realize what man could look him straight in the eye with such confidence. Suddenly, Harase ordered the girl to go with him. On reflection, Adeline called the guy a bad man. He refuses to give a wedding, but he wants to marry her, and all he says is a couple words. Left behind by her husband, the protagonist didn't understand how she could have loved him for 25 years. And even the first and last time they met, he was still cold to her. Then, Adeline, turning and looking at her husband, smilingly asked him if he intended to accompany her. After a while, Duke decided to take a little rest and stopped to talk to his friend, not understanding why Aster, his both well-when said protagonist, is a humble icon. The worried guy said something very strange, since when he first saw her, she seemed to him definitely a modest lady. She couldn't even lift her head to look at him because she was so excited. Suddenly, the men noticed that the Duke's carriage had arrived, so they decided they needed to head back to the mansion. Meanwhile, Adeline in the carriage could see nothing around her, and did not realize whether she had arrived at the mansion or not. As she got out of the carriage, she immediately met her husband, who informed her that he had to take a different route. He was also very curious if his wife had heard anything about magic, to which Adeline smilingly replied that of course she had heard. She also had to realize that while it may not be enough, she knows how to use it. She got all her knowledge of magic from her husband, who taught her in her past life. Then the guy was very curious about what magic she could use. However, the girl stated that she was very tired right now and didn't want to show her magic right now. At that moment, Haras said he didn't understand why everyone says the Lawton family's youngest daughter is very modest, but that seems far from the truth. Adeline, looking the Duke straight in the eye, asked him to go and find himself another more modest woman if he didn't like the way she was acting. Haras then asked his wife if she had ever used teleportation magic, to which she replied that she never had. At that moment, Herzeg started using this magic, stating that people usually lose consciousness when they use the portal for the first time, so he asked the protagonist to be careful. So he's already experienced, he can handle it. However, he doubts the protagonist can handle it. Adeline, smirking despite the portal, decided that she would try her best to endure it. Then she stepped into the portal. Then, Haras thought the woman had finally left. However, instead of teleporting back to the mansion, Adeline teleported next to a tree next to the Duke. Then she told her right away that she wanted to propose a few things, which surprised the Duke a bit since he thinks the girl is not in a good position to make proposals. Adeline smirked. She didn't understand why he thought that, since they had something they wanted to get from her, and of course they wouldn't get it for free. Hearing this, the Duke was a little surprised and asked the girl if she was that prophet. As Adeline expected, Haras thinks she is a prophet, has also decided that she will live as a prophet, and she has no reason to correct this misunderstanding. Then she stated that she wanted to be treated according to her abilities. Plus, she didn't want to change her last name and would continue to live on as Adeline Lawton. When the Duke heard this, he was completely bewildered and didn't understand why the protagonist didn't want to change her surname. Also, Aster, worried, added that if she wants to use her former one, then other men will continue to court her and it won't look very pretty. Adeline said that it would be good if they started worrying about her not from that point, but from when they were discussing marriage. Also, she asked them not to worry, since she doesn't show the slightest concern about what others will think of her. She also thinks his captain thinks the same. Hearing this, Haras calmly stated that the protagonist can do as she pleases. The Duke thought it was not a bad suggestion, however he didn't understand why it was weighing so heavily on his mind. Herase also, he was even a little happy about it, since actually there might reduce his tedious work. However, himself, I don't understand why he is reluctant to let her do it. Like she's trying to minimize the association with him. Meanwhile, the protagonist looked at the guy, explained to him that she will pretend to be the Duchess of Benzarl in the eyes of the public. However, in reality, she will still be Adeline Lawton when she will be alone. She also added that she has a romance for marriage ceremonies. So she wants an extremely impressive ceremony. Before that, however, she suggests that the Duke be in an alliance and pretend that they are already married. Then the heroes shaking hands finally came to an agreement. However, Herase felt disappointed, though it is a very good offer. Suddenly, some guy runs up to them saying the heroes are back too soon. Stopping and looking at Adeline, he assumed something most likely Duchess, and he is honored to meet her. This guy's name is Mavin, and he is the Benzark household's butler. When the protagonist looked at the butler, she immediately remembered how he was the only one in her past life who cared for her in the duchy. Suddenly, the girl remembered how that butler had been attacked by some tentacles, and she herself was shocked by that memory, so she assumed that she might have forgotten about it, and now she suddenly remembered it. Mavin noticed that Adeline's complexion had changed, and he began to worry about her health, so he asked if she was all right. To which the protagonist worried and waving her hand replied that she was fine, and she just felt a little dizzy. However, she was actually quite puzzled and didn't understand why she remembered Mavin passing away and why she suddenly remembered it now, so she assumed that her memories were not completely intact. Blushing, she thanked the guy for his concern. Also, she asked the guy if he was going to call her by her name, which surprised the butler a little. He didn't understand how he dared use Duchess Benzark's precious given name to refer to her. However, the main character explained to him that her name wasn't precious at all for him to care so much about it, so he could call her by her name. She did it all. In the sense that a past life is just a past life, and she wouldn't let past things happen again in the same way. Meanwhile, Herase, with a disgruntled face, was compelled to allow the butler to call the protagonist by the name of the. Then, looking at her husband, Adeline smirked and told him that he had to accompany her to the carriage, which annoyed the guy a little. But because they had an agreement, he had to put up with it all. After a while, the protagonist, along with her husband, were already in the carriage, and the butler and Aster were in the front of the carriage, where they were talking among themselves. Mavin was still a bit shocked by the new Duchess, as she seems rather unique. He also added that this is the first time he sees the Lord to sigh like that. This surprised Mavin a little, and he added that he could even see how nervous the captain was, which surprised the butler even more, as it was the first time he had ever heard his lord ever get nervous, as he had never done such a thing before. Aster agreed, adding that although it's very strange, things can happen in life. Thinking, Mavin thought about the fact that he had never once in his life seen the Duke express any emotion. However, he thought that things might get a lot more interesting from now on. Adeline, meanwhile, was in the carriage with Herase, and they didn't talk about anything at all, which she herself feels quite uncomfortable about. Looking at the Duke, the protagonist didn't understand why he was staring at her so intently, so she thought it would be better if she would ride next to Mavin. Mentally calling him a silly monkey, she felt as if he was trying to read her thoughts through her eyes. However, it was impossible. Also, looking at the land through the carriage window, she realized that these lands still looked barren as usual. In these lands, there are castle walls. If they go a little deeper into the forest of darkness, and once they pass by those, there is the central residence and the Black Tower. In that place are the servants' lodging and stables. Adeline didn't understand why the people of this duchy aren't at all interested in decorating their lands, so she assumed that the Hertz don't know how to manage their lands at all, since this whole spacious land looks wasted, and only used as a carriage road. At that moment, the protagonist told Herase that she was thinking of decorating this garden to make it beautiful, to which the guys replied that she could do whatever she wanted, which surprised the girl a bit. And she didn't understand how he could say that when she said she wanted to make the garden even more beautiful than the imperial families. Also, the Duke didn't understand why the protagonist was holding herself back on a strange occasion. At that moment of reflection, the protagonist did not understand why she repressed herself so much in the past. But she is now, if not interested, as she is now an iron woman who can do whatever she wants. and that is what she deserves. In this case, Adeline decided that in this life she would do everything she couldn't do in her past lives. So she had already started thinking about what kind of trees she would plant in the garden and what kind of flowers to plant in the flower beds, so she decided that tomorrow she would sort it all out. Finally arrived at the mansion, they were immediately met there by servants who immediately came to them with the words that they would serve them. Also, the servant asked the protagonist if he should begin preparations so that she could remove her old age, which the girl promptly agreed to, as she was feeling very tired indeed and wanted to get to bed quickly. The servant asked the girl to follow him. Also Maven, that on the 3rd floor the rooms are very large and there is good sunlight penetration, which is very good. Besides, the room of the protagonist will not be near the room of the Duke, so she will feel safe. But actually, Adeline was now very happy to see the living Maven, as he's the only person who supported her in this mansion in her past life. In the next scene, they were already outside Adeline's room, where a servant was slowly opening the door. Finally entering her room, the main character was happy to finally enter this room, because in her past life the owner of this room was not her, the person who became the female head of this mansion instead. One day when her husband had been away for a long time, suddenly he came back with some girl beside him. It was a beautiful girl with scarlet hair and brown eyes named Hella Alton, and she took all the rights away from Adeline that she had originally gotten. So the protagonist promised herself that this time, she wouldn't let her lose again. Harasi suddenly asked the girl if she liked this room, to which she replied positively, adding that it was to her liking. Meanwhile, Aster and Maven were behind Haras, and were very surprised by the girl's answer. When the Duke left the room and only the protagonist and the butler were left in the room, he told her that he was really very shocked right now. He explained that he wasn't the type of person who would follow someone's feelings so closely, and then Adeline was very interested in how the Duke would normally act. To which the butler replied that the Duke would normally have immediately gone to his room without even saying anything. Also, he immediately added that he was not saying that Harase is a bad person, but his personality is a bit blunt. Smiling, the protagonist replied that she understands everything, and she believes Maven. However, she actually realizes that Dukes is not a bad person, and he is just cold and calculating. At the moment where the butler was explaining to Adeline that she could use the bell to summon the maids at any moment, the girl reflected that normally she would have called the Duke the worst person. However, because he was only using this marriage as a tool, she wouldn't call him that. Maven asked Adeline if she wanted to have lunch now, which surprised the girl a little since she didn't even know that time flew by so fast. So she decided she'd hold off on dinner since he had a lot of things to organize. When the butler heard that, he left the main character's room wishing her a good night's rest. After a while the protagonist was resting on her bed, someone wanted to enter her room. This someone turned out to be a girl who introduced herself as Catherine, adding that she would assume the role of her maid from now on. At that moment, Adeline remembered how her past life she had asked this maid to take care of her. However, Catherine replied that she too wanted them taken care of. During their first meeting, this maid showed respect to the protagonist. However, after a while she started to look down on her. Meanwhile, the maid asked the protagonist how old she was, to which the protagonist replied that she was 22 years old, and asked the maid to leave her room, as she would call her when she needed her. As she left, Catherine became very worried, not understanding why Adeline reacted the way she did, so she assumed she might have made a mistake somewhere. As she was leaving, the maid accidentally caught the flower pot and it began to fall to the ground. When the protagonist saw this, she immediately got up from her bed and headed towards the maid, saying that it could be very dangerous. So the protagonist decided to catch the maid so she wouldn't fall on the flower pot shards and accidentally hurt herself. At that moment, the maid began to worry a lot because this flower pot cost her wages, and she didn't even know what to do, worrying and biting her nails, and wondering whether she should apologize or not. Suddenly, Adeline was finally able to reach the maid, telling her not to worry about that flower pot, but her safety. But I asked how she was feeling, and if she hadn't accidentally hurt herself. Then the maid immediately began to apologize to the protagonist, saying that it was her mistake because she was in a hurry. But Adeline asked the maid not to get too upset about it, because it was just one mistake, and there was no reason to make a fuss about it. As she went away, the girl added that Catherine need not worry about that flower pot, and the girl would call on her again in the afternoon. When the maid heard that, she was completely shocked. She didn't know the new Duchess was so kind and wouldn't punish her for her mistake. The maid didn't even know that she would turn out to be such a wonderful person. So she realized that she was stupid to get envious at the news that she was getting married to Master. Also, Catherine was struck by Adeline's beauty, thinking she looked like a doll, and she still can't believe she is the personal maid of such a wonderful man. So smiling, she decided it was her duty to tell everyone how cool and beautiful the Duchess was, and she would try to make Adeline the most respected person in the house. Meanwhile, Horace is in his room thinking about his wife being behind that wall, but he doesn't understand why, and he can't forget what happened that day. He liked it a lot, but he realizes he doesn't have the luxury of being worried about a girl like that, so he can't understand why it bothers him so much. Suddenly, someone knocked on the door. As it turned out, it was Aster who came into the room and said that he wanted to talk to the Duke about their future plans. Also, the guy said that he was very interested in what we Duke is thinking about right now. However, the Duke replied that if Aster was going to talk some nonsense, he wouldn't listen to it, and he was more interested in talking about prophecies. Horace also added that the woman said she could open his eyes, and that probably means he'll be able to tell the difference between heavenly beings called Devas and demonic beings called Asuras, which the guy didn't like, since he doesn't understand why the Duke keeps calling the main character this and that woman. Aster also added that Adeline is now a duchess, and if I keep calling her that, the mercenary will look down on her. However, when the Duke heard this, he said that now was not the time to talk about her title, and they had a mountain of things to talk about. But Aster stood his ground and wouldn't stop saying that he thought that was the biggest problem right now. He began to explain to Duke that Adeline was now his family, and maybe he'd forgotten that already. But people tend to live their lives forming good relationships. They get engaged and married, and after a while, of course, they have children and start families. At that moment, Horace replied that he understood exactly what Aster was talking about. But he doesn't have the luxury to be playing house like that right now. After the heavenly demonic war ended with Davis' defeat, they lived only for the rebirth of the Paradise Kingdom. It had been 60 years since the Duke could and too woke Aster and Wakan, and they could find no trace of other divas. Plus, there was even less information about Demon King and Demonic Realm's entrance. Then the man thoughtfully asked his friend if he had been entrusted with any messages from Wakan, and if he could find any trace at all of the Devas who entered Tranquility, to which the guy replied that Wakan did contact them, but all the information he gave them was useless. However, they did manage to find some tracks, but couldn't just hold out because of the extreme cold that was there. So Aster once again reminded the Duke that he would rather leave the matter to him than Wakan, as he is not at all patient, to which the Duke agreed. Also, Aster added that when Wakan returns, it will be necessary to go to the land of ice, and it would be best if the captain also joined them. And even if they use teleport magic, it'll take them a couple days to get there. Trying to use his magic, Horace said he had very little sacred power left, so he assumed he had no choice left. Suddenly he started thinking about the main character's words when she said he could use magic. So he didn't understand how a prophet could use magic. The Deva's Tree of Life is dead, and the Tree of Asura should have also gotten weaker with their leader hiding themselves. Exactly why divine and demonic beings who could use magic disappeared from this life. This tree is the source of both divine and demonic power, so when the tree withers, naturally the powers are also gone. And because the roots are the same, Asuras and Devas are unable to tell whether the other is using divine power or demonic power. He also remembered a prophecy that said the protagonist was the one who could see the truth and would open his eyes. So he's very curious about what this prophecy might mean, and whether her ability to use magic has anything to do with it at all, and what it means to use magic, sacred and demonic power in general. Also, Horace understood why he felt incredibly uncomfortable when looking into Adeline's eyes. Meanwhile, it was morning, and the main heroine woke up in her room was in complete bewilderment, not realizing that it is a canopy and where she is in general. Looking at her room, she finally remembered that she was back at Benzark Duchy and now living her second life. Even thinking about it, she thought it was pretty funny. She died and came back to life by coming back in time. Suddenly, a maid came into her room and asked the protagonist how she wanted her to prepare the meal. Namely, shall Catherine lead Adeline into the dining room, or would she prefer that the maid brings the meal here? To which the protagonist replied that she would eat in the dining room, and she also added that she couldn't leave the room dressed like that. So she asked the maid to help her with it. Adeline suddenly asked Catherine if she still continued to stand frozen like that, head down, what little the maid had. The girl asked the maid to raise her head as she didn't like talking to someone while looking at their top head. So the maid promptly raised her head, which was already beginning to please Adeline, and she added that to sit with her head down. It was a waste of such a pretty face, and now much better. Opening the closet with clothes, the main character expected to see there a lot of dresses, which she all wanted to try on, since the clothes that she is wearing now has a wrinkle, but opening the closet instead of a pile of clothes, she saw nothing. Then Catherine apologized profusely, saying that it seemed they had not yet had time to properly prepare clothes for her. So the maid stated that she would quickly go and buy something for the Duchess. This surprised Adeline a little, and she didn't understand how maids were even allowed to leave the mansion at this time of day. Besides, all the clothing stores should be closed at this time of day. So the girl asked the maid not to worry, as it was the Duke's fault for not being prepared to welcome his bride, and she also asked Catherine to fetch Mavin. Left alone in the room, the protagonist realized that she has a huge job to do in this house, and she should teach her husband how to treat the ladies of the house properly. Suddenly, the butler came into the room, smiling, asked the protagonist why she called him, to which the girl replied that she wanted to ask him for something. She asked the butler to fetch her a couple of his grace's clothes. So, what needs changing immediately? But as the butler has already noticed, he doesn't have any dresses. When the butler heard this, he was utterly bewildered, and did not understand how the Duchess was going to wear men's clothes. But Adeline has reiterated that she needs her husband's clothes, the man who created this situation, and who doesn't care about her at all. Because it's his mistake, she wants to wear a couple of his clothes. Mavin was still in complete shock and realized that the protagonist was trying to turn his lord into a normal human being, but it would take a lot of hard work for her to do so, as he was not an ordinary person. So he immediately ran to the room where tell to take his clothes. In addition, the maid also ran with the butler, saying that she would call someone who was good with the game. When the protagonist saw this, she was a little surprised by the passion of her subordinates. She also realized that this life is full of things she couldn't even imagine in her previous life. Then she wasn't allowed to do anything in the dressing room, so she was forced to go to the dining hall multiple times with wrinkly dresses. Besides, back then, she had never even thought to call for a butler, and even her personal maid had never looked into her eyes with such friendliness as she did now. Meanwhile, the Duke was in his study, not understanding why this woman wanted his clothes, to which the butler explained that she had nothing at all to wear, because he had no commission to buy her dresses. But Horace loudly slapped his hand on the table and didn't understand why she should wear exactly his clothes. So he asked the butler to find a maid of similar size and ask the protagonist to wear her clothes, which greatly shocked Mavin, and he told his lord that he could not do so. Also, the butler added that the Duke should not even joke on the subject, because asking a duchess to wear servants' clothes is very, very insulting. The Duke, holding some paper in his hands, did not understand why she could wear men's clothes and could not wear servants' clothes. But Mavin added that married couples must be of one body and one mind, which surprised Horace even more, since the butlers couldn't look him in the eye properly before, and now he was trying to lecture him. Suddenly the Duke blushed and imagined the main character wearing his clothes, and he even thought it would be nice to look at that. After a while, Adeline finally dressed in her husband's clothes, which fitted her perfectly, and Catherine remarked that the girl now looked like a young noblewoman. Then the protagonist told the maid that they had to hurry up since they were already running late, which the maid took a picture of. Walking around the mansion, the protagonist thought that even though she can't make her own clothes, she has someone who can make them in her size. So the girl thinks the thing she had to do herself, now she can leave it to the others. Even if it feels a little weird, Adeline feels refreshing as she's finally able to remove herself from that suffocating corset. Plus, blushing, she thought she even liked walking around in these clothes more than her own, and she decided she would dress like this more often. At last, approaching the entrance to the dining room from their mouths, there meet the two cutters, who immediately pleased them by declaring that they had already finished preparing the. Suddenly looking at the main character, he was very surprised by her new look, and he decided that she looked more beautiful than he would have thought. Even more beautiful than Aster. Hearing this, Adeline asked the butler with a smile if Aster was the only person that came to his mind when he thought of someone beautiful. The butler replied that he shouldn't even say anything about the Duke, as everyone already knows that he is very handsome. But his mouth is a problem. However, still Aster has some princely charm, and you could say he is the stereotype of what a handsome man can look like. Plus, he is a little different from his grace. Suddenly, Maven asked the main character what she thought of their lord, and whether he was at all handsome to her, which surprised the girl a little, and she immediately blushed. She immediately claimed that Maven was messing with her right now, and how could he even think that about her? That anyone at all could care whether he is handsome or not, since the most important thing is his wealth, and being rich is the best, and thus she will be able to enjoy many things. Then the butler bowed to the girl and said that he would do his best to ensure that Maven could enjoy the lord's fortune. Honestly, there was a time when the protagonist looked at her husband favorably without conditions, and she wanted to tell the harsh truth. However, the one who inevitably dealt with her was her husband, and now she sits here again. But for some reason again, she is alone. Meanwhile, Maven watched Adeline, who suddenly stopped eating, and for some reason she stopped, so thought she couldn't eat that food anymore. So approached the girl, and worriedly asked if there was anything she didn't like right now. Also, he said that he could ask the chef to prepare a new meal at any moment. To which the girl replied that it's fine and he shouldn't worry about it, and she just stopped to think about it for a bit. Also wondering if his grace usually always dislikes along with someone else. The butler replied that the Duke usually eats separately in his room, which surprised the protagonist a bit. And she said that she felt as if the butler wanted to say that the Duke is usually that type of person too, so you have to understand him and ignore it. Then the guy started to feel awkward, and already started to correct himself. However, the girl stated that they did nothing wrong, so he shouldn't do it. She also added that even though it's normal for him, she has no reason to understand and ignore his actions. Plus, when they're already married, she wants the butler to call him over and they enjoy dinner together, and with him. So she asked the Duke to call him here, tell him that if he didn't come here, she would starve herself to death. Entering the Duke's study, the butler noticed how he was enjoying his meal and not thinking about his wife at all. He immediately informed him that the Duchess had said she would starve herself unless the Duke joined her for dinner and they would eat together like a normal couple. That a little surprised Haras has called the protagonist a rather troublesome woman. Meanwhile, Maven didn't stop asking the Duke to go downstairs to the girl, because it might spread rumors that Duke Benzark was molesting his new bride, and it would be a disgrace for their whole house, which irritated the guy even more, and he asked the butler to stop giving him lessons. Stand up from the table. He asked us to have Maven prepare him a meal downstairs, which pleased the butler. And showing a thumbs up, he praised his grace's decision. Pondering, the Duke realized that he should confirm how much the protagonist knew about them, and this might be a great opportunity. He wouldn't mind doing so. After some time, Inherseg did go down to his wife, who was very glad to see him, and at once thanked him for his clothes, promising that she would be very careful and try not to spoil them. Then the Duke with a stone face added that enough in men's clothes, it suits the protagonist well, which surprised the girl a little, and she was very surprised that her husband would not even say that these clothes on her looked just fine, and fit her perfectly. To which the man holding a small kitchen knife remarked that it was asking too much of him. Adeline said that if he didn't like it, she could go back to her house right now, and what would he do in that case since he wanted them to get married? Besides, if he wants to indulge her, he should, but the girl didn't know her husband was such an irresponsible man. Hearing this, the Duke was even a little worried and realized that his wife did not want to give up. Also, you did not understand why she continued to pretend to be his wife, despite the fact that she did not want to take his surname. But he still gave in and said that this clothing is a beautiful fit for her. Adeline immediately calmed down and thanked her husband for the lovely compliment. However, she still doesn't understand why the thoughts of her not taking his last name still can't get out of his head. However, smiling, she still suggested that the Duke start eating, as the food could get cold now. She said that from now on she would call him Ray, which did not surprise the Duke at all, and he said in a calm voice that she could do as she pleased. It surprised the girl a little, and blushing, she realized that this life might be a little different from her past life. So she asked Ray to just call her Adele from now on, since she's sure he doesn't plan on calling her that woman anymore. And that woman. To which the man agreed, for the first time named the main character Adele. At that moment, Adele immediately remembered fragments of her life, where her husband also called her. Because of this, she went into a stupor and did not answer any of her husband's questions. Suddenly, when her husband started yelling at her asking if she was okay, the girl responded by saying that she was fine, and she was just overwhelmed by the taste of the salad, even though she hadn't actually tasted it yet. However, she didn't really understand what that voice had just been, and she realized that there was no way she could forget if she could be called by her name. However, she was sure that in the last 20 years, he had never called her by that name before. Even if her memories are fragmented enough, the girl is still sure of it. Even if she can't remember her husband's face in her past life, she doesn't understand why his voice sounded so desperate. On the evening of that day, the heroes were quietly outside, where they gazed at the beautiful stars in the sky. Suddenly, the girl was approached by her husband, who, calling her by her name, pleased her greatly, for she liked this. But Ray had come to her for another purpose, namely to ask how much she knew about them. In a calm voice, the protagonist replied that she knows that he is Diva. Also, she knows about the war between the heavenly realm and the demonic realm, and that the heavenly realm was defeated. The heavenly demonic war. It was a war that happened on this earth between the heavenly realm and the demonic realm about 512 years ago. Originally, the Middle Ream, the one that people called home, was the neutral territory between the heavenly realm and the demonic realm. So the heavenly realm's Diva and the demonic realm's Asura frequented here to enjoy themselves. However, promises not to invade the middle realm were broken, and after a long war, the Deva were defeated by the Asura. Ray remained the only Diva's last leader, Durlot. It was a story that the protagonist heard from her in her past life. On those stories, there were no stories about him at all, so she wants to hear his story. Also, the girl said that she had many different dreams, but not all of them were clear, and there were those that were blurry, which is actually a lie. So she wants to know his story, where he was born and how he lived and what he wants to do in general. Ray realized that now that he thought about it, he didn't even know what to say. When I never thought of myself that way before. So he said all he had was a desire to steal the Tree of Life, and his past was not important, and he had nothing to tell her, since he'd just survived a hard war. He also said he was born from the Tree of Life, a couple months before the war started. The Duke also told his wife an interesting fact about this, namely, Diva and Asura grow faster than ordinary humans, and it takes only 3 or 4 months to match the appearance of a 5 to 6-year-old human child. Then he continued his story, saying that the treaty between Diva and Asura dissolved. They tried to make the Middle Realm their own, ignoring the gods' rules. However, the relationship between them was not originally so bad, but because people worshipped them. Also, people categorized the white Diva as good, and the black Asura as evil. But yet their nature is not at all different from man. They are both good and evil, just like men. And that is why they have sometimes helped men and sometimes harassed them. And that's why they probably both wanted the Middle Realm even more. Fights were common then, and they didn't last very long. But the war quickly spread to the Middle Realm, and the Diva started losing. All this will be because Demon Queen Camilla, the Asura's leader, has long been preparing for this war. They ended up reaching the heavenly real, burned down the Tree of Life, the origins of them. All the sacred powers that came from this tree were completely destroyed, and because Deva could no longer use their sacred power, they quickly lost the war. At the height of the war, Ray was designated as Durlot's successor, but before entrusting in all his knowledge, Durlot died. So he was suddenly entrusted with the position of the Heavenly Realm's leader. Well, the enemies didn't bother to attack them every day, and because of that, Duke lost many of his companions, and even his family just died helplessly. The Divas who managed to survive this heavy war have fallen into a deep sleep called tranquility, in order to heal all their wounds. Ray, as the sole survivor, must find them in their tranquility. Also, the Demon Queen also fell into tranquility in the middle of the war. However, the Duke found it very strange that she had fallen into this state, even if she wasn't badly wounded. But still he decided to take advantage of the situation, and it allowed him to hide and find other Divas. And the people he could find were Wakan and Aster. Adele asked her husband if he could find them in the Middle Realm, to which the man calmly replied positively, that because the heavenly realm had been destroyed, they could only sleep in the middle realm. The Duke also added that because people left these lands, called them sinister, he was able to move here, which is a good place to gather all his forces. Smiling Girl asked her husband if the goal he's pursuing is revenge, to which the Duke replied yes, saying that initially he needed to awaken all the remaining companions from their tranquility and gather all their powers once again, to finally deal with Demon Queen Camellia, and then Ray can finally get his tree back in life, because he needs it to carry out Durlot's calling and rebuild the heavenly realm. Looking her husband straight in the eye, the protagonist had no idea he had such a difficult history. In her past life, she thought he was just cold-blooded because of his calling as Durlot. But because the Duke is in pain all the time, he can't let his anger out. I keep putting up with everything, and that's why his eyes are so sad. Gently touching his hand, Adele called him a very brave man, even if he had to be lonely for that long period of time. Also, she promised him that she would always be at his side, so he didn't have to worry about it anymore. Blushing man, not knowing whether his loneliness was due to his desire to tell the girl all that had happened in his life. Was that why his hands felt cold, where hers brushed against his? It's been a month since the main character arrived at this palace, where for some reason everyone was very busy and the butler was running from side to side saying that now he is very busy. As it turned out, not only the butler was very busy, but all the servants in this house who were carrying some things. Adeline gave different orders right after looking around the castle. Namely, the protagonist wanted to deal with the garden first, and make it more beautiful, since it's very dull right now. In addition, Maven always heard the Duke say that the protagonist can do as she pleases, as if he were a robot programmed to say the same thing. But still he likes how things have suddenly changed since the Duchess came to their castle, as everyone has started to look happy. While the butler was walking through the garden, there was a man who was also surprised by all this. Maven was surprised to see Wakan, who didn't know what was going on. After a while being in the Duke's room, Wakan asked him if he had not really married, and why, and with whom he had done so. Aster explained to Wakan that the Lord did it because the main character is a prophet, and he married her a month ago when Wakan was still on the land of ice. Also, he said that the girl's name is Adeline, and she is a noblewoman. However, Wakan in a rage told Aster to stop talking as he is now talking to the Duke. However, Aster replied that this doesn't seem like a normal conversation, as Wakan just came and yells at their lord. So the man shouted in rage that he'd better help his captain get rid of it, and if he was here, he'd never let it happen. To which Aster calmly replied that he was one of the men who had urged him to marry, which infuriated Wakan even more, since he was the one who had to find the most suitable wife for the captain. The men never stopped staring maliciously into each other's eyes, as if they were competing in something, but Wakan gave in, saying he wanted to see the face of the woman the Duke had chosen. Left in a room with only the Duke, Aster didn't understand why this guy doesn't always get so frantic when he visits them. Also, he asked his captain if they should stop him somehow. He replied that they could just let him be, which surprised Aster a little, since he thinks even the captain should treat her with respect. Which Ray, of course, agreed with, adding that they're not doing anything yet, and the protagonist will be able to single-handedly deal with someone like Wakan. However, because he's still excited, he should give him a heads up later. Meanwhile, Wakan was walking viciously through the garden, not realizing what Aster was thinking when he was looking for a wife for the captain, since it had to be not just an ordinary woman, but Durlot's wife. So the man understood how someone could take care of such an important matter while he was on the land of ice. So the man decided that if the protagonist wasn't somehow special, he would pursue her immediately. Suddenly, he noticed some girl talking to some service and he immediately realized it was her. Wakan began to call the main character to talk to her, but she ignored him in every possible way and did not pay attention to him at all, which made the guy very angry. So he's already started yelling at the girl, asking if she even knows who he is. To which the girl calmly replied that she also wanted to ask him the same question, and why Wakan was being so rude to her if he already knew the answer. When the man heard that, he was completely shocked and didn't understand how the girl knew his name. He also didn't like the fact that he was spoken to so casually. The protagonist asked the man to answer her question first, but Wakan smirked and replied that she was not the new Grand Duchess but a mere human. However, the girl objected, and said that she was Adeline Lawton, the wife of Duke Horace Benzark, and the Duke is Waken's master. And Waken is now talking down to the Duke's wife, so the protagonist asks the man if he will also continue to look down on her, since she is also his master. The guy was totally shocked when he heard that, and immediately said he wasn't planning on doing it. Adeline suddenly noticed the sword behind the man, and immediately said it was the holy sword Nicargras, which surprised the man, and he didn't understand how some woman knew about it. The protagonist explains that the Duke probably already told him she's a prophet, and because of that she knows. But Waken thought it wasn't true. Sighing, the girl added that even if a man calls himself a loyal retainer, he can't even listen carefully to master. Also, the protagonist can awaken this sword, but in order for her to do that, Waken must acknowledge her. This surprised the man, and he said it was nonsense because this sword fell asleep when the heavenly realm's tree of life died, and this sword cannot be awakened until a new tree of life grows. So he didn't understand how a mere man could awaken such a mighty sword. Adele said that in any case he won't lose anything and she can try and awaken this ball. Besides, she knows very well that this item is very dear to the guy since it's the sword the Commandant Fabian used to use, to which the guy agreed, and added that Fabian had lost this sword during the war, and it had been recovered recently. So he was very curious if the girl could actually awaken this sword. He was holding on to this sword because it had lost its light, and if this sword regains its power, Waken wants to give it back to the captain. So holding this huge sword in his hands, he asked the protagonist if she could bring it back to their Derlo. Smiling, Adele replied that since Waken wants it so badly, she has to make it happen. She also explained that the reason she wants to introduce this sword is because she wants Waken to protect her husband with this ball. Then using her magic, she began to awaken this sword, and this sword began to glow blue, and from it began to emanate and small lightning. Also she in some incomprehensible language. Waken, looking at this, couldn't believe his eyes, as normally a human would never be able to do this, so he didn't realize who the main character was. At that moment, Adele had already finished the ball awakening, and holding this mighty sword in her hands, asked the man to pay with this sword, since from now on it was now his sword. Looking at the main character, Waken was in complete shock, and did not understand how an ordinary little girl who is even smaller than him has such a strong magic. So getting down on one knee, he immediately apologized to the girl and promised that from now on he would treat her with respect. He also introduced himself by saying that his name was Waken Huin, and he would follow all her orders and use this sword to protect the Duke no matter what. Adeline smilingly accepted the knight's apology and said that she should introduce herself again, which she promptly did, adding that she hoped they would get along well. She also asked the guy to call him Adeline from now on. Then Waken went back to the Duke's office where he chatted with his friend. Once inside, the guys immediately started taunting him, asking him if the protagonist had dealt with him, and that's why he came back so quickly. However, Waken abruptly drew the sword that was already awakened, and the blue crystal that was in it glowed. When the guys saw it, they were in complete shock and didn't understand how it could have happened. To which Waken calmly replied that this sword was asleep before Adeline picked it up. Then it began to glow. A couple seconds later, he was already fully awakened. He also added that at first, he thought that the tree in his life had also started to grow back on their side. However, if that had happened, the captain would have realized it immediately. Waken thought something all complete nonsense and the protagonist is actually an ordinary person, is not a prophet. However, after all he saw, he just would not have a marriage to believe in it all. In addition, Adeline spoke in Deva's tongue. Meanwhile, Aster realized that Waken wanted to fight him. But Waken immediately realized that he would win because he had a holy sword. The Duke was very surprised that his wife could speak Deva language. The languages of the Deva and Asura can be learned by a human being, but they cannot pronounce the words correctly, so they are not able to speak this language, and only prophets among humans are able to speak these languages. Adeline is a prophet, and that is why Ray insisted on this marriage. However, he did not understand why he felt so anxious. While on the street thinking, the protagonist remembered how, in her past life, this sword was not actually awakened by her, but by Hela, so everyone called her useless. But this time she did it, which honestly surprises her too, since she was bluffing and didn't expect it to work somehow. Staring at her hand that began to glow, the protagonist wondered if it was actually magic. So she decided she should avoid showing off her powers in front of others like she had done before. Plus, even Wakan was a little surprised by it. After Aster taught Adeline magic in his past life, she practiced it alone whenever he had the chance to do so, resulting in her being able to use magic instantly without chanting the activation word. Also, the girl remembered an incident that had happened 1 or 2 years before her death. Namely, she ran up to her husband rejoicing that she had learned magic, but he had no way of using it, so she could only show it to Ray. And by doing so, she could somehow help him. However, Ray, instead of being happy for his wife and saying how smart she was, ordered her not to use that power in front of other people, which left the girl in a stupor, and then she didn't understand why she shouldn't. And since then, the main character has never used magic in front of other people. Even the magic she uses wasn't that complicated, if he wasn't that surprised by her magic. The problem was probably the fact that she could use her magic without chanting the activation word. So Adeline thinks that if it was a problem then, it's more likely to be a problem not now. However, the protagonist was frustrated because she couldn't remember everything that happened when her husband asked her not to use this magic. She didn't even know if he was angry, or if he was yelling in rage, but she could sense that he was very worried about her for some reason. Suddenly, looking to the side, the girl noticed the maids asking her if they should prepare a tea table here. Also, she, the maid with purple hair, added that Benzark Duke House is vibrant with Adeline around, which is strongly brotherly on the main character, and she rejoiced for that. The maid also asked the protagonist if the training ground was under construction, to which the girl immediately agreed, saying that she wanted to recruit new knights to help the Duke. The protagonist realized that her past life was very boring, and because of that, she told the maid that she was going to learn swordsmanship from Wakan, which surprised the maid. Adeline added that her dream was actually to become a better swordsman, wielding a famous sword, so she hoped that maybe someday she could learn it from Wakan, but the maid smilingly said that the Duchess was good at joking around. Even though the protagonist said it in jest, she is going to learn to wield the sword from Wakan, as she can easily hide the fact that she can use magic. So if she uses such a sword, and even if she uses an aura blade, people will still be convinced that she is just a swordsman. Also, the protagonist remembered how in her past life, Ray was always talking and hiding behind his back. However, now she doesn't want to hide anymore. Then she began to speak her thoughts out loud and stated that she really wanted to become stronger before she would succumb to the influence of others, which especially put the maid in a bit of a stupor. So the maid at once told the girl not to worry, for she was already strong and would never yield to the influence of others, and in general the Duchess was the best. When Adeline heard that, she smiled and thanked the maid, calling her Rebecca. After a while, the protagonist recalled fragments from her past life in which Aster, with a disgruntled face, asked if they really had to drag the protagonist along with them when the captain almost died because of her. But Ray was adamant that she go with them. Meanwhile, the protagonist was crying, not understanding why her husband always wants her by his side, even if she is completely useless. Suddenly, Adeline woke up in her comfortable, soft bed and realized it was all really a dream. She assumed that she had only dreamt it because of the incident with Wakan, but she didn't understand why then she couldn't forget it all day, and she wondered how long it would take to numb herself from the memory. And how long will it take for her to render her usefulness to erase all those horrible memories and doubts? Looking up at the night sky, she realized again that this was her room now, and she wasn't living in that shabby and cramped room like in her previous life, but a real duchess in the room, and so she should be happy about it. But she felt very lonely. Even though she really hates him and despises him, she's just waiting for her heart to not remember him anymore. It had been 2 months since that moment. Aster, being near some building, didn't realize how it had been built so quickly in just 2 months, and he was very curious about how the main character would use the building. But Ray just stood there silently staring at his friend, not even knowing what to say. So Aster advised him to ask his wife, since she should know. Wakan also added that if this continues, they will soon be calling Adele their captain, but she is already the captain because she is the captain's wife. Suddenly, from behind them, appeared the protagonist, who explained to the men that this is the new dormitory for the new knights she is going to hire. Also, in fact, to finish so quickly this building, she used her magic. but no one knows about it. Aster was a little surprised at this, and did not understand why they needed a new dormitory. They already had a large enough dormitory that should be enough for all the knights. But the girl explained to him that besides Deva, they were going to use mercenaries in order to make the knight order. Aster asked the Duke in utter shock what was the matter and what it was all about. However, Ray was also shocked and could not remember receiving any reports. Adeline added that she can't believe that this is true, and she can't decide such critical things so haphazardly by herself, and she clearly got permission from Maven's butler. Suddenly, Duke remembered how one day the butler came to him, and Ray signed a document saying he allowed the main character to do whatever she wanted. And that's when he realized he'd screwed up big time. Walken didn't understand why the main character suddenly wants to use mercenaries instead of normal knights, since they are very tough and rough, which Adeline agreed with, but she had no choice at all since they don't have a good number of knights at all. Besides, the Diva's numbers aren't much to mention. They all entered tranquility, so it would take a while to awaken them. Plus, they need to get information from Asura, and they have to awaken the Diva. Also, the main character added that if they start recruiting normal knights, how many would tread through the forest of darkness to apply? And then the guy finally realized why they recruit mercenaries instead of normal knights, since mercenaries will follow the prophets, and the girl thinks it's not so bad. Besides, the mercenaries are very much like them, so they act more brutally to survive. Suddenly, Adeline asked Aster to teach these knights well, which greatly shocked the guy. He doesn't understand why. So suddenly, she decided to choose him as a teacher for the mercenaries. He explained that he has never taught people, but the girl said that everything will be fine, and she is sure that Aster will be good at teaching new knights. But in fact, she knows that in his past life, Aster was also teaching knights, and he was good at it. Suddenly, looking at her husband and the knight, the protagonist suddenly laughed, saying that they both looked like puppies, and she couldn't contain her laughter. Wiping away tears of laughter, Adeline said she has something she wants to confide in Walken, and she wants to talk to her husband separately. However, luckily, because everyone is gathered here, the protagonist wants to tell them something. However, she is afraid they will think she is crazy to hear what she has to offer. And it was at that moment that she said she would make a path through the forest of darkness. Walken immediately began to worry and began to explain to the girl that this place can be very dangerous. But the protagonist immediately told him himself that she knows exactly what the forest of darkness is. Suddenly, Ray declared with certainty that he would not allow the protagonist to do so. Adele expected to hear such a response from her husband, and declared that she wasn't so crazy as to go through those woods without a plan. However, the Duke still stood his ground and said that even though she could decorate the castle, build all sorts of buildings, and create new knight orders, he would not allow her to decide to go through that forest, so it could be very dangerous. So the protagonist immediately reminds her husband that she is a prophet, and she knows very well that this forest is made up of heavenly realm plants. But Ray didn't understand why his wife was planning something so ridiculous that she even knew about it already. When the protagonist heard this, she got a little angry because she didn't understand how he could say that her plan was ridiculous, not even listening to the end of what she wanted to say, because it surprised the man a little and he asked her what she meant. Adeline explained to her beloved Ray that she would never do anything to harm him or Davis, as her goal is to grant all of her desires within 10 years. In addition, the protagonist wishes to spend the rest of her life in these lands, living in comfort and well. Aster was greatly surprised when he heard about the girl's plans, and that she wanted to do it in only 10 years, since they actually thought it could take up to 200 years to do it all. Adeline asked the guys not to worry because if she does, it is possible and they will achieve all their goals. After looking at Walken, the protagonist immediately asked him if he could teach her how to be a good friend from now on, since it seems that she will have to protect her dubious husband herself. Hearing this, the men were completely shocked, and the Duke himself did not even know how to react to it, as he did not understand how an ordinary woman could protect him. The Duke promised his friends that he would deal with them if they started laughing, but they still couldn't contain their laughter, and started laughing loudly. After the men had finished laughing, the protagonist asked them to listen carefully, as she would now explain how she will make a path through the forest of darkness, and how in less than 10 years she will end this war. The first thing she does is go to Maven Island, which surprised Aster a bit since they're now talking about the Forest of Darkness. And how did they suddenly head to Mavane Island? In addition, Wakan asked the girl if she was going to go there alone, since the place was so far away that even teleporting wouldn't help, and it would take over a week by boat to get there. Smiling, the protagonist replied that he was right. It was how she was going to go through there alone, and she even planned to visit Mokran City. But everyone immediately started talking her out of it as the place is full of terrible criminals. Basically, she has 3 reasons, and she doesn't say she'll just be making a path, because she knows the value that Davis give this forest. The bizarre plants that fill the Forest of Darkness are actually all plants from the heavenly realm. The plants that originally only grew in the heavenly realm happened to take root in the middle realms, and that was why they were distorted so bizarrely. But the inherent power of the plant did not completely vanish, so it acts to protect the Benzark ducal family. If a normal human stepped into this forest, on the other hand, they would be overwhelmed by the plant's energy and die or go insane. They may not be able to block the manifestations of the Azure, but since they can block the avatars of the Asura who borrow the bodies of humans. In addition, the protagonist realizes that everyone is very disturbed by her plans. Before the heavenly demonic war erupted, the Devas, who received an ominous prophecy, spread the seeds of the heavenly realm onto this land.